President, I rise today to introduce a piece of legislation that I have introduced in every Congress since 1987, a proposed constitutional amendment requiring Congress to balance our nation's budget. This bill has bipartisan support and will allow us to finally begin, Mr. President, to get our fiscal house in order. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, I believe, is the only certain mechanism that will break the cycle of deficit spending. I believe, Mr. President, that we must ensure that the government does not continue to saddle our children and our grandchildren with the current generation's debt. Essentially, this amendment that I've proposed requires that the United States not spend more money than it receives in revenue, except in times of war or when suspended by a vote of 3/5 of both houses of Congress. Mr. President, this bill that we propose will provide financial stability to our nation. Bailouts, stimulus programs, government takeovers of private industry, and costly new programs have consumed and have overwhelmed the federal budget. Over the past 30 years, annual deficits have become routine, and the federal government has incurred massive debt, nearly $14 trillion and rising quickly. For a moment, just let me share this chart with you. And it says, the case for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. If we go back to 1980, just 30 years ago, we owed as a nation $909 billion, not yet a trillion. This was after nearly 200 years of government, including the First World War debt, the Depression, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, and many deficits. But from 1980 to 1990, this jumped to $3 trillion. And from 90 to 2000, a 10-year span, it jumped from $3 trillion to $5.6 trillion. And that was pretty bad. But, Mr. President, from the year 2000 to 2010, which just ended a few weeks ago, it went from $5 trillion to $13 trillion in 10 years. It's slated now in the next 11 years to go to $25 trillion. That is unsustainable. In fact, Mr. President, just for the record, the United States has only had 2 years in its entire history where it's been debt-free. Look back a while. It was 1834 and 1835. I repeat, only 2 years free from debt. It seems to me, Mr. President, that the most powerful nation in the world has had its weaknesses exposed. Foreign markets cannot stand on our wobbly financial legs. Mr. President, the reverberations of our fiscal ineptitude have not only cost American jobs, which we badly need, but have weakened how other nations perceive us. Something must be done. Unfortunately, we do not have to look back far in history to see an example of a once great empire sitting on the curb with its hand held out. Greece's excessive public spending, coupled with a massive borrowing campaign, has put its fiscal insolvency woes on the entire European Union. Greece's bond rating was downgraded to junk by S&P in April. Bondholders were warned that they could recover as little as 30% of their initial investment. The euro weakened and the European stock markets plunged. Mr. President, the question is, will the dollar soon be seen as junk to the rest of the world? I hope not. American taxpayers are rightly infuriated by the federal government's disregard for the same, Mr. President's, economic principles that govern every household and business budget. Until the federal government is required to spend only the amount of money that it takes in, I fear that we will continue to write checks that the Treasury cannot cash. In the year 2010, the total interest alone on the Treasury debt securities was $413 billion. I believe this money could be better spent on improving education, supporting our law enforcement, or even better, by returning it to the people who earned it, the taxpayers. Mr. President, we hear on a daily basis the rhetoric about tough choices, sacrifice, and austerity. What we need to hear more about, I think, is basic mathematics when we're talking about the budget. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution is the solution, I believe, to a perpetual problem that we do not have the political will to fix. It will finally put our nation on a path to paying off our national debt. The adoption of an amendment that would require the federal government to do what every American already has to do, balance its checkbook, is exactly what this country needs to prove that Washington is serious about accomplishing this feat. A balanced budget amendment is simply a promise to the American people that the government will spend their hard-earned tax dollars responsibly. Some opponents of a balanced budget amendment state it's a drastic measure, not necessary at this time. They are also correct that it is bold, but I believe it is also necessary. I have introduced this legislation, as I said, in every Congress since 1987. But if not now, Mr. President, when? I yield the floor.